I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone and welcome back to VLGA Connect. It's time for another edition in our very popular Local Leaders series, where we get to know a little bit more about mayors or CEOs at councils around the state of Victoria. And I'm delighted today to have the mayor of, I think quite proudly, the smallest council in Victoria. In fact, it's the only borough that we have, the Borough of Queenscliffe. And Isabelle Tolhurst is with me. Hello, nice to meet you.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here and to find out a bit about you, but also what you're dealing with there in Queenscliffe. And we might get this out of the way at the top of the program, because you've been in the news a little bit lately, dealing with some, shall we say, challenging community issues and calls for intervention that, if I may say, I thought you handled very well at that recent council meeting. Has that been the biggest challenge you've faced in your time as mayor, do you think?
We've had a few challenges in my time as mayor. It probably started when we put forward a policy about active transport, which proposed a trial for reducing the speed limit to 30 kilometres. And that was sort of the first thing that brought a lot more people to our council meetings and certainly heightened community engagement and frustration. But that's okay. We were very open to hearing that feedback and remain in that process of tabling the feedback to make sure the revised version considers all that. But following that and the sort of sustained interest in that particular strategy, certainly the motion of no confidence that came to us in the June meeting is one of the bigger pieces we've had to confront as a council and consider how we want to wade forward on.
And look, at the heart of that, it seemed to be some frustration around project delays, cost blowouts, which is not unique to the Borough of Queenscliffe. Has it been a challenge to get people to understand that these are broader issues that the sector everywhere is dealing with?
That's a good question. I don't know the degree to which people in our community are cognizant of the wider environment, and to an extent I appreciate that. You're living in your community and facing your own challenges, particularly in this current economic environment where cost of living, and there are a number of other pressures that perhaps inhibit a capacity to think more broadly about how the state is faring. But certainly we think there are a number of causes and solutions to the issues that were tabled in that no confidence motion. And as you would have seen and as has been reported, we still believe and continue to offer the conversation with community members, because we think that's where we're going to get the best solutions and sort out exactly what is at the nub of some of these concerns.
Is it somewhat frustrating that you have to be confronted with a big, shall we say, controversial issue to get the level of engagement that you would probably want to have across the board as you work through council issues?
Yeah, I feel, as I said, even though it's been challenging the last few months and the engagement has been mostly frustration or negative around things council have put forward, I'm still thrilled that we're getting lots of people at meetings, lots of people making submissions to council, asking questions, because that is what a thriving democracy is all about. So yes, I wish it wasn't necessarily in the negative or the critical, but I think if it sustains and people turn their eye to local government to understand how it works, what it is, how it can be better, and ultimately my preference would be, Chris, that they respect it more as the closest arm of government to people, which is an unbelievable privilege to work in, but also I think it's an arm of government that can do a heck of a lot because of its proximity to people.
We might come back to current issues, priorities, the sort of legacy you're looking to leave as mayor a little bit later, but I would like to find out a bit more about you and how you come to be the mayor of the Borough of Queenscliffe. Can you talk us through your journey to becoming a councillor in the first place? Is that something you'd always aspired to do?
No, it had not been a long-term aspiration, and I don't know how many people say yes to you on that one, but I'd be interested to know.
Yeah.
But I was motivated by really undertaking a bit of a gap analysis of the current group of councillors when I ran in 2020. So I saw a group of 4 men and 1 woman, and thought, for a community that has about 57% women, that's certainly not an accurate representation on a gender front, nor was it, even as the oldest council in the state as well as the smallest, it wasn't an accurate representation of the changing demography of our community, which is seeing more families come. I didn't see people flying a flag for the arts particularly strongly, and certainly the environment, and what was eventually adopted, which was the Climate Emergency Response Plan, was brimming at the time, but I certainly didn't see that it had been embraced fully by council. So it was by seeing what wasn't there that I stuck my hand up and thought I'd like to have a go. But I missed out in 2020 by 8 votes. I came in 4th after the first preferences, and then the preferences pushed me down to place 6. So I missed out and sort of moved on and went and had a baby and did some other things. But we had an extraordinary vacancy created in 2022, pardon me, by the passing of Councillor Susan Salter, who was a long-term and long-serving councillor. So I became a councillor in just April 2022. So I had to make a radical decision as to whether that was still the right decision, because, you run a campaign, see how it goes. It was a thrilling experience, but you sort of move on when you lose. So I made the call to come back because I thought it was a really fascinating and privileged opportunity to seize, and then was fortunate to be unanimously elected mayor in November 2022. So it has been an extremely steep learning curve, but a fabulous one that I don't know is paralleled or could be matched by any other experience outside of local government.
You talk about that process that you went through to decide, am I still interested in being a councillor? Because we do move on. We've had a case just very recently in Strathbogie Shire where a countback resulted in a person who stood in 2020 not taking up the opportunity to come on council. So we recognise that things do change, but you've got some pretty strong ties to the Queenscliffe community from a family sense, haven't you?
Correct. So my forebears, Henry Charles Dodd, was the first postmaster of Queenscliffe. On his gravestone in the Point Lonsdale Cemetery is the remark that he was a pioneer of Queenscliffe, as were many of the Dodds, and there is a Dodd Street in Queenscliffe to acknowledge the contributions of that family. He also was instrumental in setting up the first bank. And while I haven't lived in Queenscliffe my whole life, I went to kindergarten down here, and we've remained fierce holiday makers ever since, which is not uncommon. About 50% of the population are transient and just holiday makers, but certainly strong ties by way of my great-great-grandparents. And Henry Charles Dodd also wrote a book called Early Memories of Queenscliffe, which is captures some very astute reflections of the community at the time, and is sort of been not immortalised, but remains a really accurate reflection of the life and times of Queenscliffe in the 1800s and early 1900s as well.
That's fascinating. You mentioned that transient community, lots of holiday makers, etc. Does that present particular challenges for you as a council and as a mayor to engage with those people? Because you do make decisions that are obviously going to impact on their experience, aren't you?
That's absolutely right. It does. And it's interesting that we've just received our community satisfaction survey, and the differences in opinions of non-resident ratepayers and resident ratepayers are quite stark. In fact, the residents tend to have less favourable views about how council is doing its business, while the non-resident ratepayers seem to think we're doing a better job across the spectrum of issues that survey assesses. So we do try and make sure that when it comes to consultation, of course, every ratepayer, irrespective if they're living here or not, has access to that and can contribute, and that we're looking for a good spread of participation in consultations, and considering that is the reality of our community. 3,500 people living for the quieter parts of the year blows out to 17,000 over the busier periods, and then that's dotted with some other busy periods around Easter and the Queenscliffe Music Festival. So it can be a challenge because these groups can often have differences of opinion, but we recognise that's who we are, so we have to let that be reflected in our consultation and ultimately our decisions.
I've been distracted from talking about you and getting back to council issues, and there's some other questions on that front I will come back to. But let's talk a bit more about your journey to being where you are as the mayor. You're a journalist, still working as a journalist, or is that something you put behind you?
I've hit pause on the journalistic work, Chris, and I regard myself comically as having Australia's two most hated professions, working in politics and the media. No, but I don't work as a journalist anymore. The last work I was doing prior to taking on the mayoralty and deciding that mayoralty was going to be my full-time focus, and it certainly has been a very busy full-time job, and I commend anyone who's doing any other work alongside mayoralty in any municipality in the state. But the last work I was doing was running a media centre for a youth not-for-profit. So encouraging young people and youth-led organisations to use the media to advocate for their causes and to better understand how the media is a storytelling platform and increase like a tremendously influential space on which to put forward a case and have it argued and debated by the wider public.
You worked for publications in Denmark and Indonesia, I understand, amongst your journalistic postings. Can I assume that you worked in those countries at those times?
That's correct. So it was 2009. I was in Denmark, so very early, and then covering the COP15 Coalition of Parties global environmental gathering there, which was fascinating for the Copenhagen Post, which is the news in English in Copenhagen. And then I've also worked at the Jakarta Post covering diplomatic and arts affairs. And then back in Australia, worked a lot in the arts and arts media, but also in not-for-profit sector and also diplomatic affairs. So through AusAid and Australian Volunteers International and DFAT.
How did you come to get those international journalist roles? Was that a concerted plan on your part, or accidents?
A bit of both.
Yeah.
These opportunities tend to open the door to other opportunities, but mostly through university. So I'd do a period of study, either coursework at a local university or a linguistic undertaking, and then would go and work locally with those skills. And sometimes the publication would rightly demand you'd done some language training, even if it was basic. But those opportunities established through universities and relationships between universities in Australia and Denmark and Indonesia respectively really were the root of how I got to be overseas working as a journalist, which was really thrilling. And actually in Denmark particularly, some of the best training I've ever had, because they've got a really practical and immersive approach to getting stuck into journalistic work to get their journalists trained.
Is that a pathway that you'd recommend to young people looking at journalism careers, to try and get those overseas experiences?
Perhaps not overseas necessarily, but certainly practical. And that was the reality for the time I was both in Australia and overseas. It was always doing the study, but also undertaking a lot of work in the field, whether it was mostly voluntary, which was one of the reasons I sort of steered away from pure journalism and into more media roles in various organisations. But certainly the practical is enormously beneficial, and you can't like being a mayor, like being in local government, you can't learn this job until you're in it. And I think that's very, very true of journalism.
Are there any observations or insights that you've gained from working in those overseas postings that help you in your councillor or mayoral role, do you think?
I think being a journalist has been incredible training for being in local government. The constant engagement with people and the public, the need to often present an impartial or two-sided story, three-sided in some cases, there's one side, two sides, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. But this absolute necessity to engage, to communicate, to consult. I was often in radio in Australia, in community radio. So learning to talk slowly, present an idea was very advantageous when it came to chairing meetings and facilitating conversations with community. So I think it's been invaluable training that I still regard as some of the most valuable skills I bring to my role as mayor.
So let's come back to Queenscliffe and talk a bit about current challenges, future aspirations, etc. It is the smallest council in the state. As you've said, it's got an ageing population. I think it's got the oldest demographic in the state. How much pressure do you feel as a council to justify your existence given your small size?
I think as the smallest council, the fact our size and the limitation on resources is a perpetual strain, no matter what political views or perspectives or initiatives the councillor group want to pursue and further. That is always going to be a challenge, and we have to do it right. to justify our existence. And I think that's to an extent what the motion of no confidence challenged was, are we, it didn't explicitly say we're no longer viable, but I think it raised issues which could strain that argument about, are we still financially viable and viable from a governance perspective to run as an independent council? So it's a constant issue we're battling, but we have just produced a budget that I think reflects we certainly, from a financial perspective, are sustainable and considered in our decision making when it comes to how we use resident and ratepayer money. But it is something that we're cognizant of all the time. But I think there's a lot of support for our independence and size. I think there's a huge advantage to being small in many ways, and how we seize it, how we utilise our size to do things differently, to test ideas, to communicate really, really well with community will be the test. And if we do that right, I think we can make the case that we should remain independent. And it is certainly worth acknowledging the enormous community fight that was put up in the 90s to resist amalgamation. And while we haven't done any polling to understand if that's still the opinion of the community, I believe it is. And certainly when the no confidence motion was tabled, there was a lot of community coming forward saying, we love who we are, we love our size, we love the fact that we're independent and unique, and we would fight for that too.
You often hear people from around that time talk about the story of how Queenscliffe managed to carve out its own existence in that amalgamation process. And whether it's true or not, I believe there was some pretty politically influential people that went into bat for Queenscliffe, which swung the battle in the end. But I wonder, is that true? Is that your understanding of how it played out?
It is my understanding of how it played out. Speaking of this, several sides to a story and the truth being in the middle, I have heard a range of different stories, but that is a central theme, is that there was some heavy hitting political representation from and in Queenscliffe that was able to lever a strong argument about Queenscliffe remaining independent. And I think it was hard fought, though. I think it was put to those politicians or politically influential people by the community who felt really strongly that it wouldn't be in Queenscliffe's interest to amalgamate, and we would lose some of what made us unique. So yes, that is my understanding, and I believe 2024 is a year in which marks about 30 years since amalgamation, and a time at which some additional documentation around that matter will be released to the public. So perhaps if we meet up again in 2024 and can pore over those documents to see exactly what went down, Chris.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you for that tip. We'll look forward to it. How reliant are you on your neighbours? Because that's another story I often hear that, Geelong, I'm not so sure about Surf Coast, certainly help you with service delivery because you don't have the capacity to do everything on your own. Is that true?
Yeah, things like maternal health, for example, are delivered by Geelong. We pay a fee to them and they support in the delivery of that. That's an interesting example because our baby or infant population is extremely small. So it makes sense that we're using a provider that's well established in that for the small amount of people that serves. On the aged care side, we're still delivering that completely in-house, but that's something we're very proud of, but it is a separate issue. We are reliant on neighbours, and I think we should be all reliant on our neighbours. I think collaboration in local government is where good outcomes are going to come from when it's done right. And the interesting challenge we face by way of understanding who delivers what, when and why is that we cut a postcode. So while we've always preserved the borough's remained intact as it was sort of first drawn out, we cut 3225 now down Fellows Road. So there are people who live in Point Lonsdale, but they're not part of the borough. They're part of City of Greater Geelong. So they're using the services of Queenscliffe and Point Lonsdale. They're attending our primary schools, going to our medical facilities, but they are Geelong residents. So I think while we're reliant on bigger councils to provide services for us, I certainly think it is worth tabling the argument about how that arrangement might go the other way. and how we accurately reflect when we apply to state and federal government for funding, or we look at who we really are demographically beyond what the census tells us and the boundaries belie, we can say, we might be able to look at a different way to collaborate that recognises that reality.
Yes, you remind me, and it pays us all to remember that people don't live to municipality boundaries. They live their lives, they access the services that are most convenient to them. And that's played out a bit in Tasmania recently, where the discussion of amalgamations has been occurring, and the forced amalgamations are now off the table. Isabelle, you're well into your mayoral term. What are we, July as we record this, a few months to go. How are you tracking on your mayoral plan or your checklist of what you want to achieve this year?
I think we're doing okay. I'm doing okay, Chris. My intent was to continue the financial viability and sustainability. That was a really big piece I made mention of in taking on the mayor's position and making an address at the time of being voted in. And I'm really pleased with the budget we have delivered. We have things that I campaigned on, and I think it can be a really different environment once you're in as a councillor, working out how you're going to, or if you even can deliver on the things you've committed to or wanted to do in campaigning. But certainly things like the ongoing implementation of our climate emergency response plan are very important to me, and the issues that are tabled there affect other areas, including our relationship with the state, including a development of a coastal marine and management plan, because we are a coastal community that's facing inundation and a number of other threats to our precious and sensitive environment. So I think ongoing environmental management is a really key priority for me, and we are progressing with that. I think managing, this wasn't earmarked as something I wanted to do, but it remains a challenge for the borough, and something I think is tremendously fascinating by way of how we have a conversation with community about it, is we are a heritage town and celebrated for many of the heritage features and values that we have, including things like the post office my grandfather helped to build. But how does a preservation of heritage sit alongside an environment where there is a real demand for increased density? There is a real demand to look creatively at social housing. And while the borough will be and should be limited in how it can contribute to that, I think we do as a community have to confront that discussion. So it's something that's sort of boiling away in the background, and some of the timing of that conversation or that issue may be forced upon us by the state to an extent, but I think it's going to be something that comes up that we'll have to progress. But something that transcends all those issues and all issues at council is community consultation. So we're about to undertake a review of how we do community engagement and consultation in the borough, and really that would be such a triumph if I could emerge from my mayoralty having begun work to improve that and do it in a really deeply collaborative way with community. I would be thrilled.
You've answered my question about how you'd like people to look back on your mayoralty. Is this something that you would like to do again? And by that I mean future terms as a councillor as well as being the mayor.
I have not made a call on future terms as a mayor. It's been a really big job, Chris. It's been a very challenging job at times, and terribly personal, which is not something I feel fondly about as a councillor. And I worry about that. And I think that is something that's affecting councils around the state. We're seeing Yarra Ranges and Monash having to close their doors to public meetings, which is a terrible indictment on democracy, but a necessity to keep people safe, and councillors have a right to go to work and be safe. But I worry that the job appears too challenging in sometimes to encourage a great new group of candidates to put their hand up. So I don't know about another term of councillorship. I would love to have another go at mayor, because I feel like I'm just warming up. And I think to be a mayor that's visible, that's available, that throws themselves into everything and really immerses themselves in the triumphs and challenges of their community is a job well done. And I hope that's the message I'm sending to people.
You use the word personal. Is that because you're finding being the mayor is exposing you to behaviours perhaps that you weren't expecting or prepared for?
There's perhaps some naivety in it. around to what degree you are, visible and accessible to people. But what I'm seeing play out is often a critique or criticism of people, not issues.
Yeah.
So it's become, there is some criticism around what I represent, the politics or values I hold, as opposed to debating the issues on their merits. And I worry that if that's the tenor of community discussion and debates, that it can feel very threatening and challenging for people. And some people don't want to take that on, and I respect that entirely. I think to an extent it's part of the job, but I would be very cautious of saying people just have to accept relentless personal criticism to do this job, because I don't think that's correct.
You also mentioned some of those councils that have had to make changes to the way they conduct their council meetings. And as we record this, Greater Bendigo's announced they're going to require photo ID for anyone attending a council meeting for the rest of the year. Have you had to make any changes to how you run your meetings in Queenscliffe?
No, we haven't. And we're really pleased that we haven't. We don't anticipate that we'll have to. We've had rigorous engagement. We've had high attendance, which has not been a negative. That's a fabulous thing, even if it's been, tensions have been high or concern has been high. But no, we haven't encountered a situation yet where we've had to consider or make any changes to the running of our meetings. We are examining our governance rules to see if there's a better way to engage with community, particularly around petition submission and question time. And question time has certainly been longer and bigger than it has in any time I've been on council, sort of 30, 40 minutes. Personally, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's really important to answer people's questions if they've taken the time and brought them to council for council's attention and consideration. But at this stage, no safety concerns, and we're really thrilled and continue to invite people warmly to council meetings.
Long may that continue. Mayor Isabelle Tolhurst from the Borough of Queenscliffe, it's been a delight to speak with you. I've enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better, and I wish you the best for the rest of your mayoral term.
Many thanks, Chris. Great to chat.